They thought they were in control, two officers pulling over a lone driver, ready to throw their weight around. But what they didn't know was that the woman behind the wheel wasn't just any driver. She was their new boss, the chief of police, and this stop was about to change everything. Kendra Hayes had always been a woman of quiet strength, a woman who knew what it meant to rise above. After years of hard work, today marked the beginning of a new chapter, her first day as the chief of police in the bustling town of Cedar View. It was an achievement she had fought for, overcoming countless barriers, including a justice system that seemed built to keep people like her down. As Kendra drove down the winding highway leading into the city, the early morning sun cast a warm glow over the horizon. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, just a bit tighter than usual. This was supposed to be a day of celebration, but Kendra couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at her. Cedar View wasn't just any town. It had a reputation. Known for its deeply conservative culture, Cedar View's police department had long been marred by reports of bias, particularly against minorities. Kendra had read the reports, heard the stories, and she knew that many officers had voiced their displeasure at her appointment, a black woman taking the helm of their department. But Kendra wasn't one to back down. As she approached a traffic light just about to turn red, a flash of blue and red lights illuminated her rearview mirror. A patrol car pulled up behind her, sirens blaring. Instinctively, Kendra's heart rate quickened. She knew this was no coincidence. She pulled over to the side of the road, the grass on the shoulder crunching beneath her tires. Two officers, both white, stepped out of the vehicle. The senior officer, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, approached her car with a deliberate, measured stride. The younger officer followed closely behind, his face tight with suspicion. Kendra lowered her window, her pulse steady but alert. The senior officer leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning her car before resting on her. "License and registration," he said flatly, his voice carrying an air of authority that felt just a bit too practiced. Kendra reached into her glove compartment and pulled out the documents without a word. She had learned long ago that, in situations like this, silence was often the best strategy. As she handed over the documents, the senior officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. The younger officer, however, wasn't as restrained. "What brings you out here?" he asked, his tone edged with suspicion. "This area's not exactly safe, if you know what I mean." Kendra's stomach churned, but she remained composed. "I'm on my way to work." "And where exactly would that be?" The younger officer pressed, leaning in a little closer. His smirk suggested he already had assumptions about her. Kendra hesitated for a moment. She could reveal her position right then and there, put an end to the charade, but something told her to hold back. She had been in this situation before, too many times, in fact. The power dynamic here was undeniable, and she didn't want to start her first day by creating tension with the very officers she would soon lead. "You'll find out soon enough," she responded calmly, locking eyes with the young officer. There was no anger in her voice, but she made it clear that she wasn't intimidated. The senior officer, sensing that things were about to escalate, stepped in. "Let's not make this difficult, ma'am. We can take this further if need be." There it was, the veiled threat, the subtle flex of authority. Kendra felt her patience thinning. She had endured this kind of treatment for years. Disrespect, condescension, assumptions based on nothing but the color of her skin. She had fought too hard and climbed too high to let this slide. Kendra took a deep breath, deciding she had played along long enough. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. "I'm Chief Kendra Hayes. I suggest you rethink how you're handling this situation." The shift in the air was palpable. Both officers froze. The senior officer blinked in confusion, his brows furrowing as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The younger officer's smug expression vanished, replaced with shock and a hint of panic. "You're the chief?" the senior officer stammered, clearly caught off guard. "Yes," Kendra said, her voice unwavering. "And I'd like to know why exactly I was stopped, and why this line of questioning is even happening." For a moment, neither officer spoke. The younger officer fumbled with his words, trying to come up with an excuse. But the damage was already done. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. The senior officer cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. "There must have been a misunderstanding," he muttered. Kendra didn't let him finish. No, this isn't a misunderstanding, she interrupted sharply. This is exactly the problem. You stop people like me without cause, make assumptions, and try to flex your authority because you think you can get away with it. The senior officer opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He knew she was right. Kendra's calm, unflinching demeanor only made their behavior look worse. You see, she continued, her eyes locked on theirs. It's officers like you who make people distrust the system, and it's people like me who are here to change that. Both officers stood in silence, their faces drained of color. Kendra could feel the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had been unjustly stopped, questioned, and harassed because they didn't fit someone's narrow idea of who belonged in certain spaces. She stepped out of the car, standing tall as she addressed them. You'll be reporting to me personally for the next few weeks. I'll be reviewing every traffic stop you make, and I suggest you think long and hard about how you handle yourselves from now on. The senior officer finally found his voice. We didn't mean any disrespect, Chief. It won't happen again. Kendra nodded, though she knew his words were empty. It would happen again. Not with these two, perhaps, but with others. That's why she was here, to root out the deep-seated prejudice that had plagued Cedar View's police force for too long. Good, she said quietly before turning back to her car. As she drove away, Kendra allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had won this round, but there would be many more battles ahead. Her position as chief of police was more than just a title. It was a responsibility to make sure that no one else had to endure what she had just experienced. Later that day, Kendra gathered the department for her first meeting. The tension in the room was thick as she stood in front of the officers, her presence commanding the attention of everyone present. She recounted the events of that morning, leaving no detail unspoken. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, she began, her voice steady. But I am here to make it clear that this kind of behavior stops now. Every officer in this department will be held accountable for how they treat the citizens of Cedar View, regardless of their race, gender, or background. A murmur of unease swept through the room, but Kendra didn't flinch. She had spent her life fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to stop now. This is your chance to prove that you are the kind of officers who serve with integrity, she continued. But know this, I will not tolerate bias. I will not tolerate disrespect. And I will not tolerate anyone who thinks they are above the law. Her words echoed in the silent room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in quiet agreement. Kendra could tell who was ready to stand with her and who wasn't. But that didn't matter. She was ready for the challenge. The room remained silent, the tension almost unbearable. Kendra's words had struck a nerve, and now the true test was about to begin. The officers were still processing the realization that their new chief, the one they'd heard murmurs about but didn't fully believe in, was standing right in front of them. The shock had settled into discomfort, and the discomfort had turned into something else, uncertainty. I don't need to remind you that your job is to protect and serve every citizen in this town, Kendra continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with several officers. But when officers make assumptions, judge people based on their appearance, or, worse, treat people unfairly because of their race, that trust between the police and the community is broken, and I'm here to rebuild that trust. The silence in the room was deafening. Kendra's eyes remained unwavering as she scanned the faces before her. Some officers seemed to be absorbing her message, their expressions tense but thoughtful. Others, however, seemed more defensive. Kendra could tell who was ready to change and who wasn't, but this was just the beginning. She had no illusions that she could fix everything overnight. She was there to create lasting change, no matter how difficult it might be. Kendra paused, letting her words settle. She knew that this moment, her first real stand as chief, would set the tone for her leadership. This is your chance to prove that you can evolve, that you can be the officer Cedar View needs. But mark my words, I will not allow this department to slip back into the old habits that plagued it for so long. Her voice was calm, but it held an undeniable weight. The officers had no choice but to listen. There was no place for indifference in her department, no room for bias, no tolerance for disrespect. Kendra had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let it all fall apart because of a few stubborn individuals who refused to change. As the meeting continued, Kendra outlined the steps she planned to take to reform the department. We will begin with mandatory anti-bias training for every officer. This training will be comprehensive and ongoing. We will also be reviewing every traffic stop, every arrest, and every use of force. I will make sure that no officer in this department believes they are above scrutiny. Accountability is key. The officers in the room shifted. Kendra noticed that some were nodding in agreement, but there were others who visibly tensed. It wasn't hard to see that change wasn't going to come easy for everyone. But Kendra wasn't deterred. She wasn't there to win popularity contests. She was there to create a department that served its community with integrity and fairness. Kendra's first few weeks on the job were filled with challenges. Some officers resisted her authority, making snide remarks when they thought she wasn't around, or ignoring her directives when they felt they could get away with it. But Kendra had a plan. She was watching closely, learning who could be trusted and who needed to be held accountable. It wasn't all bad, though. A handful of officers stood by her, working hard to bring about the change Kendra had promised. She leaned on these officers, knowing that the battle for respect and fairness was going to be a long one. At one point, Kendra visited the scene of a traffic stop, hoping to see firsthand how her officers were handling the public. She approached the car casually, blending in as she had done on her first day when she was stopped by those two officers. This time, though, she was in control. She watched as the officer spoke to the driver, a middle-aged Latino man who seemed nervous. Kendra observed how the officer interacted with the man. His tone was firm but respectful. He wasn't rushed, and he took the time to explain what was happening and why. Kendra felt a flicker of pride. This was the kind of policing she was working to foster. It wasn't about instilling fear in the community. It was about building relationships, one interaction at a time. As she approached the officer to introduce herself, the man in the car looked surprised. "You're Chief Hayes?" he asked, his eyes widening. Kendra smiled, nodding. "Yes, I'm the chief. I wanted to thank you for how you handled this stop." The officer seemed a bit startled by her presence, but he straightened up and gave a respectful nod. "Thank you, Chief. I'm just trying to do the right thing. Make sure people feel safe, you know?" "I do," Kendra replied, her gaze meeting the officer's. "I'm proud of you. Keep it up." Over time, Kendra's reforms began to take hold. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always smooth. But officers slowly started adjusting to her leadership style, even those who had initially resisted. Kendra held monthly meetings where she encouraged open dialogue between officers. She wanted them to feel heard, but she also made it clear that complacency and bias would not be tolerated. Word of Kendra's encounter with the two officers she had stopped on her first day began to spread. The town of Cedar View had always been known for its deeply conservative values, and the idea of a black woman leading the police department had shocked many. But for others, it was a sign that change was finally on the horizon. Kendra had become a symbol of hope for those who had long been ignored by the system. Her strength, poise, and determination spoke volumes. The media caught wind of her story. Headlines flashed across news stations, and social media was abuzz with discussions about Kendra Hayes and her leadership. For the first time in Cedar View's history, people were seeing the police department not as an oppressive force, but as a part of the community, working to protect and serve, not judge and condemn. But for Kendra, the story wasn't about the media attention. It wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about the work, the long, hard work that still lay ahead. The challenges of breaking down old prejudices, fighting for equity, and earning the trust of every community member weren't over. They were just beginning. As weeks passed, the tension in the department began to ebb away. Kendra's leadership was slowly starting to have the effect she had hoped for. The officers who had resisted her appointment were gradually coming to terms with the new reality. There were still moments of tension, of course, but Kendra had a method of handling it. She led by example. She didn't engage in petty confrontations. Instead, she maintained her professionalism and integrity, proving time and time again that respect was earned, not demanded. One day, Kendra was called to the scene of a violent altercation in a neighborhood that had seen its fair share of police presence. It was one of the more troubled areas of Cedar View, and the officers on the scene were accustomed to dealing with high-stress situations. Kendra arrived with her usual calm demeanor, determined to see how her officers were handling the situation, especially with the recent changes in policy. When she arrived at the scene, she saw a young black man being restrained on the sidewalk by two officers. The tension was palpable as a small crowd had gathered, their eyes filled with suspicion. Kendra walked up to the officers, immediately taking control of the situation. She calmly asked them to step aside, and with one swift, authoritative motion, she approached the young man. "Are you okay?" Kendra asked him softly, her voice filled with empathy. The young man, his face bruised, looked up at her in shock, unsure whether to trust her. But when he recognized her as the chief, his eyes softened, and for the first time in a while, he relaxed his stiff posture. "I didn't do nothing wrong, Chief," he muttered, looking away. Kendra knelt beside him, meeting his eyes. "I know. Let's talk about this calmly. No one here is trying to hurt you, but we need to make sure this situation is handled properly." The officer stepped back, watching Kendra as she handled the situation with grace. She didn't need to raise her voice or make a scene. She simply did what she had always done best: listened, empathized, and diffused the tension. The young man, finally seeing Kendra as an ally, spoke up about the events leading up to his arrest. He explained how things had escalated too quickly, how he was being treated unfairly by the officers. "Thank you for speaking up," Kendra said, standing back up and addressing the officers who were still watching. "This is how we handle things, calmly, respectfully, without assumptions or aggression." Kendra turned to the crowd that had gathered, noticing the shift in their expressions. They were no longer watching her with skepticism. Instead, they were nodding in approval. Kendra knew that moments like this were crucial. This was how she was going to rebuild trust between the community and the police department, one interaction at a time. But she also knew that this was just a small victory in a much larger fight. The officers stood silent as Kendra addressed them, her voice strong yet filled with compassion. "This is how we serve the community. Every action we take has consequences. We must be mindful of how we treat those who we are sworn to protect. Remember that." Later that evening, Kendra reviewed the body cam footage from the incident. She made notes on the areas that had escalated unnecessarily and decided to follow up with the officers involved. She wasn't there to punish them, but to guide them. Change wasn't about tearing people down, it was about building them up, teaching them to better serve and protect. Over the following months, Kendra continued to implement sweeping reforms. She led workshops, town halls, and discussions with community leaders, aiming to create a culture where officers respected the people they served, no matter their background. There was resistance, but it was slowly dying down as more officers bought into her vision. Kendra wasn't going anywhere. She was committed to this journey, and she knew it would take time, but the impact was already beginning to show. Complaints against the police force had decreased, and community engagement had increased. Kendra's relationship with the citizens of Cedar View had grown stronger, and people who once feared the police now saw them as a resource, as an integral part of their community. As Kendra walked into the office on her 4th month as chief, she felt a sense of pride. It was subtle, not a celebration of a job done, but rather the realization that she was making a difference. She wasn't just changing policies, she was changing hearts and minds. Cedar View was a town divided, but with every step Kendra took, it was becoming more united. The scars of the past were still there, but she was ready to help them heal. That morning, Kendra had a meeting with the town's mayor. The mayor had been an ally from the beginning, but even so, Kendra knew this conversation would be a pivotal moment in her journey. "I've been hearing good things about you, Kendra," the mayor said as they sat across from each other. "People are talking about the changes you're making. The community is responding to you." Kendra smiled, but she didn't allow herself to become complacent. "It's a long road, but we're making progress. I'm not here to be a hero, but to do the necessary work, to make sure that everyone feels heard, respected, and protected." The mayor nodded. "I believe you, and I'm with you every step of the way. Just let me know what you need." Kendra nodded back. "I need support. I need the backing to push these reforms and to hold everyone accountable. Officers, citizens, and even myself. We're all in this together." That afternoon, Kendra addressed the community at a public forum in the local community center. The room was packed with citizens eager to hear what she had to say. Kendra stood before them, calm and resolute. "This is about more than just policing," Kendra began, her voice strong. "It's about how we view each other, how we treat each other, and how we build a community that's stronger, safer, and more united. We have a responsibility, all of us, to help rebuild trust, to ensure that every person who lives in this town is treated fairly." The crowd listened intently, nodding in agreement. Kendra was inspiring change, not just in the police department, but in the hearts and minds of those who had once been wary of the police. "I'm not here to tell you that everything will change overnight," Kendra continued, "but I am here to tell you that we will work together, and we will make Cedar View a place where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard." The applause that followed was thunderous. For the first time in a long while, Kendra saw hope in the eyes of the people she had sworn to serve. She wasn't just the chief of police. She was a beacon of change, a symbol of what was possible when leadership stood firm in its commitment to justice. As Kendra left the community center that evening, she felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had a long way to go, and the challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like the work she was doing was truly making a difference. She wasn't just creating a better police force, she was creating a better community, and with that, Kendra Hayes knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.